If your ancestors came to America, or ever crossed an ocean to start a new life, this might be their story. The water has been foul for 3 days now. It came out of the barrel brown, thick with something you don't want to name, and you drank it anyway. You held your breath, closed your eyes, and swallowed, because the alternative was thirst, and thirst would kill you faster than whatever was living in that barrel. You've been at sea for 4 weeks. You have no idea how many more lie ahead. The ship creaks around you, a sound that never stops, not even when you sleep. The timbers groan like a living thing. The hull shudders when waves strike the bow. Somewhere above, footsteps cross the deck. Sailors doing work you don't understand, speaking in commands you can barely hear. You haven't seen the sun in 2 days. The hatches are sealed because of the weather, and the hold has become a cave. 300 people breathing the same air. Children crying. Someone coughing in the corner. The same cough you've been hearing for a week, getting worse each day. The smell is something you'll never forget. Sweat and vomit and unwashed bodies. The bilge below, where seawater mixes with waste. The food stores rotting somewhere in the darkness. You've stopped noticing it. Mostly. Your nose gave up days ago. You left everything behind to be here. Your home. Your village. The graves of your parents. The faces of friends you'll never see again. You sold what little you had to buy a ticket for this. A wooden bunk in the belly of a ship, 18 inches of space to call your own. 6 weeks of misery in exchange for the hope of something better. Everyone around you made the same bargain. The woman beside you is traveling alone with 2 children. Her husband is already in America. He went ahead 2 years ago, sent money when he could, and finally scraped together enough for their passage. She hasn't seen him in 26 months. She doesn't know if she'll recognize him when she does. The old man across the aisle left because there was nothing left to stay for. The blight took his potatoes 3 years running. His farm is gone. His wife is buried in the churchyard. His children scattered to Liverpool, to London, to wherever there was work. He's going to America because his youngest son wrote a letter that said, "Come. There's room. There's food. Come." The family in the corner speaks a language you don't understand. German, maybe, or Swedish. They keep to themselves, eating food they brought from home, praying in words that sound like songs. You've never met anyone from their country before. Now you're sleeping 3 feet away from them, sharing the same darkness, breathing the same air, riding the same waves toward the same unknown shore. This is steerage. This is how your ancestors came to America. Not on the Mayflower, that was the beginning, but it wasn't the flood. The flood came later. Between 1820 and 1920, more than 30 million people crossed the Atlantic to start new lives in the United States. 30 million. From Ireland and Germany, from Italy and Poland, from Sweden and Norway and Russia and 100 other places where life had become unbearable. They came because of famine. They came because of war. They came because of poverty so grinding that a 6-week voyage in the belly of a ship seemed like a reasonable price to pay for the chance, just the chance, of something better. Most of them traveled in steerage. The cheapest tickets. The lowest decks. The place where shipping companies packed human beings like cargo, because human beings were cargo, profitable cargo, as long as enough of them survived the crossing to walk off the ship at the other end. Tonight, I want to take you aboard one of those ships. Not as a passenger in a cabin, with a porthole and a private berth and meals served on china plates. As a steerage passenger. As one of the huddled masses, the tired and poor, the people whose names are now carved on headstones in American churchyards, whose blood runs in American veins, whose courage made possible the lives their descendants live today. This is the voyage they made, the world they endured, the crossing that changed everything. Settle in. The journey is long. The sea is rough. But there's land on the other side, if we can make it there. Let's begin where all immigrant stories begin, with goodbye. Leaving home. You don't decide to leave your homeland easily. Nobody does. The decision comes slowly, painfully, over months or years of mounting desperation. It comes in the third failed harvest, when the potatoes come out of the ground black and rotting. It comes in the letter from the landlord, the one that says you have 30 days to pay what you owe or be evicted. It comes in the funeral of a child who died from a fever that might have been cured if you'd had money for a doctor. It comes in the quiet realization that there is no future here. That staying means watching your family starve, slowly, one by one. That leaving, terrifying as it is, might be the only way any of you survive. For the Irish, the decision was made by the land itself. The Great Famine began in 1845, when a fungus called Phytophthora infestans arrived on ships from America, a bitter irony, given where so many would flee. The fungus destroyed the potato crop, and in Ireland, the potato was everything. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. It was rent money. It was survival. When the potatoes died, Ireland began to die with them. In the first year, people thought it was temporary, a bad season. Next year would be better, but next year was worse. And the year after that was worse still. By 1847, Black 47, they would call it, people were dying in the roads, in the ditches, in the workhouses that couldn't hold them all. Entire villages entered, some to the graveyards, others to the ships. For the Germans, the push came differently. Political upheaval, failed revolutions, economic collapse, religious persecution, the promise of land, actual land that a common man could own, in a country where land was plentiful and lords were few. For the Scandinavians, it was the brutal winters, the tiny farms that couldn't support growing families, the letters that arrived from cousins who'd already gone, describing a place called Minnesota where the land looked just like home but there was more of it. So much more, and it could be yours. For the Italians, it was poverty in the south, the crushing weight of a system that kept peasants poor while landlords flourished. For the Jews of Eastern Europe, it was pogroms, organized massacres, state-sanctioned violence, the knowledge that your family could be killed simply for existing. Everyone had a reason. Nobody left for adventure. Nobody left because they were bored. They left because staying had become impossible. The decision, once made, set everything in motion. The preparation. Leaving for America was not like packing for a trip. It was like preparing for death, because in many ways, it was. You would never see your home again. Never walk the roads you'd walked since childhood. Never visit the graves of your parents, your grandparents, the generations who had lived and died on this same patch of earth. Never hear your language spoken the way it was spoken here, with the accent of your village, the phrases your grandmother used. You were leaving forever. Everyone understood this. There were no round-trip tickets, no plans to return someday. The ocean was too wide, the cost too great, the distance too absolute. When you boarded that ship, you were cutting a cord that could never be retied. And so the preparations took on a ritual quality, a sacredness. Families gathered for what they called an American wake, particularly in Ireland, where the tradition was strongest. It was exactly what it sounded like. A wake for someone who was not dead but might as well be. The neighbors came. There was music, sometimes dancing, often drinking. People told stories about the one who was leaving, childhood memories, funny incidents, the time he fell in the river, the time she won the prize at the fair. And then, at some point in the evening, the tears came. The keening, the raw grief of separation. Mothers clutched their children, knowing they would never see them again. Fathers shook hands with sons and couldn't find words. Sweethearts made promises they both knew might never be kept. The American wake lasted all night. No one slept. When dawn came, It was time to go. The journey to the port was its own ordeal. Most emigrants didn't live near the sea. They came from inland villages, from farms, from places where the nearest harbor was 100 miles away. They traveled by foot, by cart, by whatever means they could afford or arrange. They carried bundles on their backs, everything they owned reduced to what they could physically carry. Clothes, mostly. A cooking pot, perhaps. A Bible or a prayer book. A photograph, if they were lucky enough to have one. Letters of introduction, if someone in America had written them. The address of a cousin, a brother, a friend who had gone before. Some carried food for the journey, bread, cheese, dried fish. The shipping companies promised to provide provisions, but experienced travelers knew those promises were often broken. Better to bring your own, just in case. Children carried their own small bundles. Some carried toys, though toys were rare among the poor. One surviving account describes a boy who insisted on bringing a small wooden horse his father had carved for him. His mother tried to leave it behind. There was so little room, but the boy wept and she relented. That wooden horse crossed the Atlantic in a 6-year-old's pocket. As they walked toward the port, they passed others making the same journey. The roads filled with emigrants, a slow procession of the dispossessed, all moving in the same direction. Toward the sea, toward the ships, toward the unknown. The port cities were overwhelming. Most emigrants came from small villages, places where everyone knew everyone, where the same families had lived for generations. Liverpool, Cork, Hamburg, Bremen. These cities were larger than anything they had ever seen. Larger than anything they had ever imagined. Liverpool was the great departure point for Irish emigrants, and for many others who traveled through Britain. By the 1840s, it had become the emigration capital of the world. More than 4 million people would pass through its docks between 1830 and 1930, most of them heading to America. The city was chaos. Ships crowded the harbor, their masts like a forest of dead trees. Stevedores loaded cargo. Sailors shouted in a dozen languages. Street vendors hawked food, medicine, miracle cures for seasickness. Pickpockets worked the crowds, targeting the confused newcomers who clutched their life savings and had no idea where to go. And everywhere, there were runners. Runners were agents, sometimes for legitimate shipping companies, often for confidence men and thieves. They swarmed the docks and the roads leading into the city, looking for emigrants to help. They offered to carry bags, find lodging, secure tickets. They spoke whatever language their marks spoke, having learned just enough Irish or German or Swedish to seem trustworthy. Some runners were honest. Many were not. They led emigrants to filthy boarding houses that charged outrageous prices. They sold tickets for ships that didn't exist, or for voyages that had already departed. They stole luggage, picked pockets, disappeared with deposits. An emigrant who arrived in Liverpool with enough money for passage could find himself penniless within hours, victim of a system designed to exploit the desperate. The lucky ones had contacts, someone who had made the journey before and sent back instructions. Stay at this boarding house. Buy your ticket from this office. Don't trust anyone who approaches you on the street. Those letters, passed from emigrant to emigrant, were survival guides. The unlucky ones learned hard lessons. Some never recovered. Some ended up in the workhouse, unable to afford passage, unable to return home. Some died in the slums of Liverpool, their American dream ending in an English gutter. But most, somehow, made it through. They found legitimate ticket agents. They paid their fares, anywhere from £3 to £5 for steerage, a sum that might represent years of savings. They received their tickets, small pieces of paper that represented everything they had sacrificed, everything they hoped for, the entire future compressed into a few printed words. And then they waited. Boarding day. The wait could last days, sometimes weeks. Ships didn't run on schedules the way they do today. They departed when they were ready, when the cargo was loaded, when the weather was favorable, when the captain decided it was time. Emigrants had to stay close to the docks, checking daily for news, spending money they couldn't afford on lodging and food. When the day finally came, it began before dawn. The emigrants gathered at the pier, their bundles on their backs, their tickets clutched in their hands. Medical inspectors walked among them, looking for signs of disease. Anyone who appeared sick could be turned away, their ticket worthless, their money gone, their journey ended before it began. The inspection was cursory. The inspectors had too many people to examine and too little time. They checked for obvious symptoms: fever, rash, persistent cough. They looked at eyes and tongues. They asked a few questions. Most people passed. Some didn't. Those who failed faced an impossible choice. Go back to a home that might no longer exist? Try to hide the illness and board anyway, risking discovery and worse? Find somewhere in the city to recover and hope another ship would take them later? Families were sometimes separated at this point. A father cleared to board, a child held back. A mother torn between staying with her sick child and keeping the family together on the ship. These were the kinds of decisions that haunted people for the rest of their lives. For those who passed inspection, the next step was the ship itself. First sight. Nothing could prepare them for the first sight of steerage. The emigrants descended a ladder or a narrow stairway, leaving the light of the deck behind. The hold was dark, lit only by a few oil lamps and whatever light filtered down from above. It was low-ceilinged, often no more than 5 or 6 feet of headroom. A tall man couldn't stand upright. The berths were wooden platforms, stacked 2 or 3 high, running along both sides of the hold. Each berth was about 6 feet long and 18 inches wide, barely enough room for a single person to lie flat. But berths weren't for single people. 2 adults typically shared a berth. Families of 4 or 5 crowded into spaces meant for 2. The platforms were bare wood. Passengers brought their own bedding, straw mattresses, blankets, whatever they had. Some had nothing. They would sleep on the boards for 6 weeks, their bodies aching, the wood hard and unforgiving beneath them. There was no privacy. The berths were open, one beside another, with only a few inches of space between. You could reach out and touch the person next to you. You could hear their breathing, their conversations, their arguments, their prayers. You would come to know their coughs, their snores, the sounds they made in their sleep. The smell hit you immediately. Even before the voyage began, steerage had a smell. The accumulated residue of previous voyages, the bilge below, the close air that never quite circulated. It would get worse, much worse. But even on boarding day, it was enough to make some people gag. And it was crowded. So crowded. Bodies everywhere, settling into berths, staking out territory, establishing the tiny boundaries that would define their existence for the next 6 weeks. Children crying, overwhelmed by the strangeness. Adults trying to stay calm, to reassure their families, to believe that this was worth it. Somewhere above, the sailors were making preparations. Ropes creaked. Commands were shouted. The ship began to move, almost imperceptibly at first, then more noticeably. And then, for anyone who ventured up on deck for one last look, came the moment that broke hearts. Watching the homeland disappear. The shore was receding. The docks, the city, the land itself, all of it growing smaller, fainter, less real. The people who had gathered to wave goodbye became dots, then disappeared entirely. The buildings blurred into a gray line. The hills behind the city became shadows. Some emigrants stood at the rail and wept openly. Others stood in silence, unable to speak, watching until there was nothing left to watch. Some refused to look at all, staying below, unable to bear the sight of everything they were losing. A priest who traveled with emigrants in the 1850s described the scene. "I have seen strong men weep like children as the coast of Ireland faded from view. I have seen women fall to their knees and pray aloud, begging God to protect the family they were leaving behind. I have seen children ask their parents when they would go home, not understanding that there would be no going home, ever. The moment of departure was a death. The death of one life, with no guarantee that another would take its place. But there was no turning back. The ship was moving, the sails were set, the wind was carrying them westward. Whatever lay ahead, the storms, the sickness, the weeks of darkness and fear, would have to be faced. The crossing had begun. For the next 6 weeks, this ship would be their world. This cramped, stinking, creaking vessel would be their home. The strangers around them would become, by necessity, their community. And somewhere beyond the horizon, invisible and almost unimaginable, America was waiting. The space. Let's start with the space itself. The place where you'll spend most of the next 6 weeks. Steerage was never designed for passengers. The word itself tells you everything you need to know. Steerage originally referred to the part of the ship near the rudder, the steering mechanism, in the lower decks. It was storage space, cargo space, the part of the ship that mattered least. When shipping companies realized they could profit from the emigrant trade, they didn't build new ships with passengers in mind. They simply converted cargo holds. They installed wooden platforms for berths, added a few ladders for access, and called it accommodation. The result was a space that treated human beings like freight. The typical steerage compartment ran nearly the full length of the ship, perhaps 100 feet long and 25 feet wide. The ceiling was low, 5.5 feet in many ships, sometimes less. Anyone of average height had to stoop. Taller passengers learned to move in a permanent crouch. The berths lined both sides, stacked 2 or 3 high, with a narrow aisle down the center. Each berth was a wooden shelf, 6 feet by 18 inches, with a board at the end to keep passengers from sliding out when the ship rolled. 2 adults shared each shelf. Families with children packed in tighter. Do the mathematics. A ship might have 300 steerage passengers. That's 150 berths, packed into a space smaller than a modern gymnasium. Add in the baggage, the food stores, the water barrels, the few tables and benches where passengers ate their meals. Subtract the space taken up by the masts, the support beams, the stairways. What remained was perhaps 10 square feet per person. In that space, you would sleep, eat, sit, stand, and exist for the duration of the crossing. There were no windows in steerage, no portholes. Light came from oil lamps hung from the beams, their flames flickering with every movement of the ship. During the day, some light filtered down from the hatches above, when the hatches were open. When storms came, the hatches were sealed, and steerage became a sealed box. Ventilation was almost non-existent. A few grates in the deck above allowed some air circulation, but it was never enough. The air in steerage grew thick with the exhalations of 300 people, with cooking smoke, with the smell of bodies and waste and sickness. Passengers described the atmosphere as heavy, suffocating, barely breathable. In rough weather, the hatches stayed closed for days at a time. The air grew worse. The darkness grew oppressive. People began to feel that they were buried alive, entombed in the belly of a wooden beast that groaned and heaved through an endless night. This was your world. This was home. The berths. Your berth was your territory, your tiny kingdom, the only space on the ship that belonged to you. 18 inches wide, 6 feet long, a wooden shelf with no mattress, no padding, no comfort of any kind. You brought your own bedding, if you had any, a straw-stuffed sack, a blanket, perhaps a pillow, though pillows were luxuries most emigrants couldn't afford. The straw mattresses were called donkey's breakfasts by the sailors, a joke that wasn't funny. They were rough, lumpy, and within days of departure, infested with lice and fleas. The bedding absorbed sweat, vomit, and other fluids. It couldn't be washed. It couldn't be aired properly. It became, over the course of the voyage, a breeding ground for vermin and disease. You shared your berth. Single passengers were paired with strangers, men with men, women with women, families grouped together as best the ship's officers could manage. The pairing was random, arbitrary. You might find yourself sleeping beside someone who became a lifelong friend. You might spend 6 weeks pressed against someone you couldn't stand. Privacy was a memory, something you used to have, back on land, back in another life. Here, everything was public. You changed your clothes in full view of your neighbors, or you didn't change at all, which is what most people chose. You slept inches away from strangers. You heard their dreams, their nightmares, their whispered prayers, their arguments with spouses, their weeping in the night. The berths were organized into sections, sometimes called compartments or divisions. Single men were typically berthed in the bow of the ship, the front, where the motion was most severe. Single women were placed in the stern, as far from the men as possible, with married couples and families in between. This arrangement was supposed to preserve morality, to prevent improper contact between unmarried men and women. In practice, the separations were flimsy. A few boards, a hanging blanket, sometimes nothing at all. The compartments flowed into each other. People moved through the space constantly, to reach the stairs, to visit the water barrels, to use the toilets, to escape the suffocation of their own berths. The boundaries were theoretical. At night, the berths came alive with sound. Snoring from every direction, the deep rumble of men, the softer breathing of women, the restless stirring of children. Coughing, always coughing. The creak of wood as people shifted, turned, tried to find a comfortable position on the unforgiving boards. Whispered conversations between husbands and wives, planning, worrying, dreaming of what lay ahead. And beneath it all, the constant voice of the ship itself. The groan of timbers, the slap of waves against the hull, the creak of ropes and the distant shouts of sailors changing watch. The ship never slept, and neither, it seemed, did anyone else. The people. Who were these people? Packed together in the darkness. They came from everywhere. Ireland, in the greatest numbers during the famine years, sometimes accounting for half or more of all emigrants. Germany, fleeing political upheaval and economic collapse. Scandinavia, leaving behind farms too small to support growing families. Later in the century, Italy, Poland, Russia, the Austro-Hungarian Empire. Jews escaping pogroms. Catholics escaping persecution. Protestants escaping poverty. They spoke different languages, worshipped different gods, came from different worlds, and yet here they were, pressed together in the same dark hold, sharing the same air, facing the same fears. The Irish kept to themselves, mostly. They prayed the rosary together, sang songs in Gaelic, mourned in a language the others couldn't understand. Many were from rural villages where English was a second language, barely spoken. They had left everything they knew, and now they clung to each other, the only familiar things remaining. The Germans were often better prepared. Many came from towns rather than farms, with more resources and more education. They brought books, tools, musical instruments. They organized themselves efficiently, establishing routines, maintaining discipline. Other passengers sometimes resented them for their relative prosperity. But resentment faded when a German passenger shared food with a hungry Irish child, or when a German doctor, traveling in steerage because cabin passage was beyond his means, treated the sick without charge. The Scandinavians were quieter, reserved. They spoke little to passengers outside their group, though whether from shyness or inability with English was hard to say. They worked with their hands during the voyage, carving, knitting, repairing clothes. They seemed to need activity, to need purpose. Idleness disturbed them. Children ran everywhere. There was no way to contain them, no space where they could play safely, nothing to occupy their restless energy. They chased each other through the narrow aisles, climbed on berths, got underfoot, drove adults to distraction. The youngest cried constantly, unsettled by the motion, the darkness, the strangeness of everything. Mothers tried to comfort them, but there was no comfort to give. The elderly suffered most. The voyage was hard on everyone, but for those whose bodies were already failing, it was torture. They couldn't adapt to the motion. They couldn't digest the food. They sat in their berths, growing weaker, watching the days pass, wondering if they would live to see America. Many didn't. And among all these people, relationships formed. Alliances, friendships, enmities. You learned who could be trusted and who couldn't. Who would share their food in hard times and who would hoard. Who told good stories and who complained endlessly. Who kept their space clean and who let filth accumulate. Who prayed and who cursed. Who helped the sick and who avoided them. A ship in steerage was a village, a compressed, temporary, floating village where 300 strangers had to learn to live together or make each other miserable. The social dynamics were intense, constantly shifting. Alliances formed and dissolved. Rumors spread faster than disease. A conflict between two passengers could divide the entire hold into factions. But there was also kindness. Unexpected, unearned kindness from people who had nothing to give but gave anyway. A woman shares her last piece of bread with another woman's hungry child. A man gives up his blanket to an old man shivering with fever. A group of passengers takes turns sitting with a dying teenager, holding his hand, praying with him, making sure he doesn't die alone. These moments of grace, small lights in the darkness of the hold, were what made the voyage bearable. The knowledge that you were not alone, that suffering was shared, that even here, in this miserable place, human beings could still be human. The crew, the sailors, were another world entirely. They lived above, in the light and air. They moved freely about the ship, climbing the rigging, adjusting the sails, performing tasks that seemed almost magical to passengers who had never been to sea. They were weathered, rough, often tattooed. They spoke a language of their own, nautical terms, commands, curses, that the emigrants couldn't understand. To the steerage passengers, the sailors were both saviors and threats. Saviors because they kept the ship moving, kept it afloat, kept it on course toward America. Without them, everyone would die. The passengers knew this and were grateful, even if they couldn't express it. Threats because sailors had power, and power was easily abused. The stories were common. Sailors who demanded bribes for small favors, sailors who stole from passengers, sailors who took liberties with unaccompanied women. Not all sailors, not even most, but enough that women traveling alone learned to be cautious, to move in groups, to avoid the deck at night. The captain was a distant figure, rarely seen by steerage passengers. He lived in his own quarters at the stern of the ship, ate different food, breathed different air. He was responsible for everyone on board, but his attention was focused on the ship itself, on navigation, on weather, on the 1,000 decisions that determined whether the voyage would succeed or fail. Between the captain and the steerage passengers stood the ship's officers and, on some vessels, a steerage steward, a crew member assigned to manage the emigrants. The steward distributed food, enforced rules, settle disputes. A good steward made the voyage tolerable. A bad one made it hell. Some stewards were patient, understanding the fear and confusion of people who had never been to sea. They explained how things worked, bent the rules when compassion demanded, treated the passengers as human beings. Others saw steerage passengers as cargo that happened to talk. They distributed food carelessly, favoring some and shortchanging others. They enforced rules arbitrarily, punishing minor infractions while ignoring genuine problems. They accepted bribes from those who could pay and ignored those who couldn't. The passengers had no recourse, no way to complain, no authority to appeal to. The captain's word was law, and the captain rarely descended to steerage. Whatever happened in that dark hold happened beyond the reach of justice. The daily rhythm. Life in steerage developed its own rhythm, a routine born of necessity, shaped by the ship's schedule and the passenger's need for structure. The day began at dawn, or what passed for dawn in a windowless hold. The ship's bell rang, signaling the change of watch above. Passengers stirred in their berths, waking to the same darkness they had slept in. Bodies stiff, backs aching, mouths dry. The first order of business was water. Each passenger was entitled to a daily ration. 3 quarts, supposedly, though the actual amount varied from ship to ship. The water was stored in large barrels, and passengers lined up with their cups and containers to receive their share. The water was rarely clean. It was stored in wooden barrels that had often held other substances before: wine, vinegar, whale oil. The barrels were supposed to be cleaned before being filled with water, but cleaning was expensive and time-consuming. Shipping companies cut corners. The water took on the flavor of whatever had been stored before, and within weeks at sea, it developed its own flavors: algae, rot, something alive and growing in the darkness of the barrel. Passengers learned to drink with their eyes closed, to hold their breath, to swallow quickly and try not to taste. After water came breakfast, if you could call it that. The shipping companies were required by law to provide food for steerage passengers, and they did, after a fashion. The provisions were basic: hardtack biscuits, oatmeal, rice, potatoes, occasionally salt beef or pork. The quality was poor. The preparation was worse. Passengers didn't eat in a dining room. There was no such space in steerage. Instead, food was distributed, and passengers ate in their berths or in the narrow aisles, perching on boxes, crouching on the floor, eating with their hands or with whatever utensils they had brought from home. Cooking was communal and chaotic. Most ships had a galley, a kitchen, where the crew prepared their own meals. Steerage passengers were typically allowed access to the galley stove at certain hours, to cook whatever provisions they had. But with hundreds of passengers and limited stove space, the cooking schedule was a source of constant conflict. Families jostled for position. Arguments broke out over whose turn it was, how long someone had taken, who was hogging the stove. The food that emerged was often half-cooked or burnt, seasoned with frustration and resentment. After breakfast, the long empty hours began. There was nothing to do. No work, no entertainment, no way to pass the time. Some passengers had brought books, but many couldn't read. Some played cards, though gambling was officially forbidden. Some talked endlessly, telling stories, sharing memories, speculating about America. Some prayed. Some simply sat, staring at nothing, waiting for the voyage to end. When weather permitted, passengers were allowed on deck. This was the best part of the day, the only part when you could breathe clean air, see the sky, feel the sun on your face. The deck was crowded when the hatches opened. Everyone wanted out. Everyone needed out. But the deck was not entirely theirs. Steerage passengers were restricted to certain areas, away from the cabins, away from the officers' quarters. They clustered in the spaces allotted to them, grateful for the light and air, watching the sea, watching the sailors work, watching for any sign of land. In bad weather, the hatches stayed closed. Those were the worst days. Days when the ship pitched and rolled, when the hold filled with the sounds of retching, when the air grew thick with the smell of vomit and fear. Days when the lamps swung wildly and shadows danced on the walls like demons. Days when it felt like the voyage would never end, like the ship would sail forever through an endless gray sea. At night, the routine reversed. Evening rations were distributed, more hardtack, perhaps some tea if you were lucky. Then darkness, as the lamps were dimmed to save oil. Then the long night in the berths, trying to sleep despite the noise, the motion, the fear. And in the morning, it began again. The same routine, the same darkness, the same endless waiting, day after day, week after week, until you lost count, until time itself seemed to dissolve, until there was only the ship and the sea and the faint, flickering hope that somewhere beyond the horizon, this would all be worth it. The boredom. No one warns you about the boredom. They warn you about the storms. They warn you about the sickness. They warn you about the food and the water and the smell. But no one tells you about the emptiness. The vast, crushing emptiness of having nothing to do, nowhere to go, and no way to make the time pass faster. 6 weeks, 42 days, 1,000 hours, and nothing, absolutely nothing, to fill them with. Back home, there was always work. The fields needed tending. The animals needed feeding. The house needed cleaning. The children needed minding. Life was hard, but it was full. Every hour had a purpose. Every day had a shape. Here, there is no work, no fields, no animals, no house. Just a wooden shelf 18 inches wide, a dark hold that never changes, and the endless rhythm of the sea. The first few days, you're too overwhelmed to notice. Everything is new, the ship, the motion, the people around you. You're adjusting, orienting, trying to understand this strange new world. You're seasick, probably, spending hours in your berth waiting for your stomach to settle. But by the second week, the newness fades. The ship becomes familiar. The motion becomes normal. And the boredom descends like a fog. You wake up and there's nothing to do. You eat breakfast and there's nothing to do. You go on deck, if the weather permits, and you stand there, looking at the sea, and the sea looks exactly like it looked yesterday and the day before and the day before that. Gray water, gray sky, the horizon a flat line that never gets closer. You go back below. You sit in your berth. You stare at the wooden beams above your head. You count the knots in the wood. You've counted them before. You'll count them again tomorrow. People handled the boredom differently. Some talked, endlessly, compulsively, as if silence itself were dangerous. They told stories about their lives back home, about their plans for America, about anything and everything. The same stories, repeated again and again, until everyone in earshot could recite them by heart. Some prayed. The Irish said the rosary together, the beads clicking softly in the darkness. The Jews davened, rocking back and forth, their prayers a murmured melody. The Protestants read from their Bibles, the words familiar and comforting. Prayer gave structure to the day. It gave meaning to the meaningless hours. Some made things. Women knitted and sewed, their hands busy even when their minds were elsewhere. Men carved, little figures, useful objects, anything to keep the fingers moving. A Norwegian passenger on one voyage carved an entire chess set during the crossing, the pieces growing more detailed as the weeks passed. Some gambled, despite the rules against it. Cards appeared from hidden pockets. Dice rattled in cupped hands. The stakes were small, buttons, bits of food, promises of future payment. But the games were intense. They provided excitement, drama, something to care about. The ship's officers tried to stop the gambling when they found it, but they couldn't be everywhere. The games continued, hidden, whispered, a secret economy of risk and chance. Some simply withdrew. They lay in their berths, facing the wall, and stopped engaging with the world around them. They ate when food was placed in front of them. They moved when they had to. Otherwise, they were gone, present in body but absent in spirit, lost in some interior space that the rest of us couldn't reach. The children suffered most from the boredom. They had energy, boundless energy, and nowhere to spend it. They ran through the aisles until adults shouted at them to stop. They climbed on the berths until someone got hurt. They fought with each other, cried, demanded attention that exhausted parents couldn't give. Some ships had nothing for children. Others had passengers who organized games, lessons, activities, anything to keep the young ones occupied. A school teacher traveling in steerage might gather the children and teach them letters. A grandmother might tell stories, gathering a crowd of small listeners around her berth. These informal schools and story hours were lifelines, for the children and for the adults who no longer had to manage them alone. But mostly, the boredom remained. A constant presence. A weight that pressed down on everyone, making the days longer, the nights darker, the voyage feel endless. The food. Let's talk about what you ate. The shipping companies were required by law to provide provisions for steerage passengers. The British Passenger Act specified minimum quantities, a certain amount of bread, flour, oatmeal, rice, potatoes, meat. The law was meant to prevent starvation at sea, and in this narrow sense, it succeeded. People rarely starved, but the law said nothing about quality, nothing about freshness, nothing about preparation. And so the food, while technically adequate, was often barely edible. Hardtack was the staple. Ship's biscuit, they called it. Sailor's bread, a dense, dry cracker made from flour and water, baked until every trace of moisture was gone. Hardtack could last for years without spoiling. It could also break your teeth if you weren't careful. The biscuits were hard. Genuinely, almost impossibly hard. Passengers learned to soak them in water or tea to soften them enough to chew. Some broke them with hammers, crushing them into pieces small enough to swallow. Some gave up and gnawed at them like animals, wearing down the edges with persistence. And then there were the weevils. Weevils are small beetles that infest grain products. They were everywhere in ship's provisions, their larvae burrowing into hardtack, their tiny bodies visible when you broke a biscuit open. Experienced travelers learned to tap their hardtack on the table before eating, knocking out as many weevils as possible. Others ate in the dark, preferring not to see what they were swallowing. You tap it, and they fall out, one passenger wrote. You eat it quick, before more crawl in. After a while, you stop caring. Weevils are just more food. Beyond hardtack, the provisions varied by ship and by how much the shipping company was willing to spend. Rice was common. Oatmeal, cooked into a thin porridge. Potatoes, when they lasted, they often rotted within the first few weeks. Dried peas and beans, cooked into soups that were more water than substance. Meat appeared occasionally. Salt beef or salt pork, preserved in brine, so saturated with salt that it had to be soaked for hours before cooking. Even then, it was tough, stringy, more gristle than meat. But it was protein. It was something different. Passengers looked forward to meat days with an anticipation that bordered on desperation. The cooking was communal, as we discussed, but the results were rarely good. The galley stove was small, the cooking time limited, the skills of the passengers variable. Food emerged half raw or burnt, under-seasoned or oversalted, never quite right. But you ate it anyway. You ate everything, because the alternative was hunger, and hunger was worse. Some passengers brought their own provisions: dried fruit, cheese, sausages, anything that would last. These private stores were precious, hoarded, shared only with family and close friends. They provided variety, comfort, a taste of home in the middle of the ocean. But private provisions ran out. By the third or fourth week, most passengers were entirely dependent on the ship's rations. And the ship's rations, by that point, were getting worse. The water in the barrels was growing foul. The hardtack was running low, replaced with older, more infested stock. The potatoes had rotted. The meat was down to the worst cuts, the pieces that had sat longest in the brine. Toward the end of the voyage, meals became exercises in endurance. You ate because you had to, not because the food provided any pleasure. You swallowed and tried not to think about what you were swallowing. You counted the days until landfall, until fresh food, until you would never have to eat hardtack again. The water was worse than the food. At least with food, you could see what you were eating. You could pick out the weevils, cut away the rot, avoid the pieces that looked most suspicious. With water, you had no choice. You drank what was given, and you drank it blind. Fresh water was stored in wooden barrels in the hold. The barrels were filled before departure, sealed, and rationed out over the course of the voyage. 3 quarts per person per day was the standard allotment, enough to survive, barely, if you were careful. But the water didn't stay fresh. Within days of departure, it began to change. The wood of the barrels imparted its own flavor, a musty, tannic taste that grew stronger as the voyage continued. Algae grew in the darkness, turning the water green, then brown. Bacteria multiplied. Things died in the water and decomposed. By the 3rd week, the water was thick. You could see particles floating in it. You could smell it before you tasted it. A rotten, swampy smell that made your stomach turn. You drank it anyway, because there was no alternative. The water is like something from a stagnant pond, one passenger wrote. It coats your tongue. It sits in your stomach like a stone. But you drink it, because thirst is worse than disgust. Some passengers tried to improve the water. They filtered it through cloth, straining out the worst of the sediment. They added vinegar, believing it would kill whatever was growing inside. They mixed it with alcohol, rum, whiskey, whatever they had, both to mask the taste and to purify it. None of these methods worked particularly well. The cloth caught some particles, but not all. The vinegar added its own unpleasant flavor. The alcohol helped, but alcohol was scarce and couldn't be wasted on every cup of water. The only real solution was time. Drink fast, swallow hard, don't let it sit on your tongue, and wait for the voyage to end, when fresh water would flow again. Dehydration was a constant threat. 3 quarts a day sounds like a lot, but in the cramped, stuffy hold, with the stress of the voyage and the salt in the food, it wasn't always enough. Passengers learned to conserve, to take small sips, to avoid exertion, to save their ration for when they needed it most. Children were especially vulnerable. They didn't understand rationing. They cried for water when they were thirsty, not knowing that the day's supply might already be gone. Parents faced impossible choices: give the child water now and risk running short later, or hold back and listen to the crying. The water barrels ran low as the voyage continued. In the final weeks, rations were sometimes cut. Passengers who had been getting 3 quarts might find themselves reduced to 2, then 1.5. The thirst grew worse. The desperation grew worse. And still the horizon showed no sign of land. Passing the time. Despite the boredom, people found ways to fill the hours. Music was one salvation. Someone always had a fiddle, a flute, a tin whistle. The Irish brought their songs, mournful ballads of loss and longing, lively jigs that got people dancing in the cramped aisles. The Germans brought their folk songs, their drinking songs, their hymns. The Scandinavians brought their own traditions, songs in languages no one else understood but everyone could feel. On good days, when the weather was fine and the hatches were open, music would drift up from steerage to the deck above. Passengers would gather in clusters, singing together, clapping along, momentarily forgetting where they were. The sailors would listen, sometimes joining in with songs of their own. Sea shanties, work songs, melodies that had crossed the Atlantic 100 times before. Dancing happened too, though space was limited. A small area would be cleared, a few square feet at most, and couples would take turns, stepping through jigs and reels while others watched and clapped. The dancing was cramped, clumsy, nothing like the dances back home. But it was movement. It was joy. It was a few minutes of forgetting. Storytelling was another refuge. In a world before universal literacy, before radio and television and smartphones, stories were how people entertained themselves. Every community had its storytellers, men and women who could hold an audience, who knew the old tales and could spin new ones on demand. In steerage, these storytellers became celebrities. Passengers would gather around them in the evenings, crowding close to hear, shushing the children, leaning in. The stories might be folk tales from the old country, heroes and monsters, saints and sinners, loves lost and found. They might be personal histories, accounts of the storyteller's own life, embellished and polished through years of telling. They might be pure invention, spun out of nothing, created on the spot to fill the hungry silence. The stories served a purpose beyond entertainment. They connected people to their past, to the countries they were leaving behind. They reminded them who they were, and they provided hope, because in stories, things usually worked out in the end. The hero won, the family reunited, the journey reached its destination. Religion filled time too. The devout organized prayer services, gathering the faithful for morning and evening devotions. Catholic priests traveling in steerage said Mass, the Latin words echoing strangely in the wooden hold. Protestant ministers led hymns and sermons. Jewish passengers observed the Sabbath as best they could, lighting candles, saying prayers, maintaining traditions in the most improbable of settings. For many passengers, religion was the only thing that made the voyage bearable. The belief that God was watching, that suffering had meaning, that heaven awaited those who endured. These beliefs provided comfort that nothing else could offer. Without them, the darkness might have been unbearable, and some passengers simply observed. They watched the sea, the sky, the other passengers. They studied the sailors at their work, learning the names of ropes and sails. They kept journals, if they could write, recording the small events of each day. They made mental notes, storing up memories they would share with children and grandchildren. Tell me about the voyage, those descendants would ask, years later. And the survivors would remember. The boredom, the food, the water, the music, the stories, the prayers. All of it burned into memory by 6 weeks of intensity, 6 weeks of nothing else to think about. The class divide. Not everyone on the ship lived as you did. Above you, in the upper decks, were the cabin passengers. First class and second class, depending on the ship. They had private rooms with beds, with portholes, with air. They had dining rooms where meals were served on plates by waiters in uniforms. They had lounges where they could read, converse, play cards at proper tables. They breathed different air, ate different food, lived different lives, all on the same ship, separated by a few flights of stairs and an impassable social boundary. The cabin passengers rarely descended to steerage. Why would they? The smell alone would drive them back. But steerage passengers saw the cabin passengers, on deck, taking their constitutional walks, dressed in clothes that cost more than a steerage ticket. The contrast was stark. The unfairness was obvious. "They walk by us like we are cattle," one passenger wrote. "They cover their noses when they pass. They do not see us as people. To them, we are cargo. Cargo that happens to breathe." The resentment was real but usually contained. What was the point of anger? The cabin passengers hadn't created the system. They were simply benefiting from it, as anyone would in their position. And besides, steerage passengers had more immediate concerns than class warfare. They had to survive the voyage first. But the divide was a preview of what awaited in America. The new world promised equality, opportunity, a fresh start. It did not promise that the old hierarchies would disappear. The rich would still be rich. The poor would still be poor. The struggle would continue, just in a new setting. Some steerage passengers had been middle class back home. Shopkeepers, professionals, people who had fallen on hard times. For them, the humiliation of steerage was acute. They weren't used to being treated as cargo. They remembered what it felt like to have status, respect, a place in society. The voyage stripped all of that away, reducing everyone to the same level, equal in misery, if nothing else. Others had always been poor. For them, steerage was just another form of hardship, no worse than what they'd known before. They had no status to lose, no dignity to protect. They simply endured, as they had always endured, waiting for circumstances to change. The ship was a microcosm of the world. The wealthy above, comfortable and protected. The masses below, struggling and suffering. And between them, a gap that money could cross but humanity could not. But on the water, at least, they were all headed to the same place. The ship that carried the rich and the poor together would deposit them on the same shore. What happened after that was another story. For now, there was only the voyage. The endless voyage. The long middle, where nothing happened and everything felt suspended, waiting for the next chapter to begin. The storm. You feel it before you see it. The ship begins to move differently. The steady roll you've grown accustomed to becomes something sharper, more urgent. The bow rises higher, falls harder. The timbers groan with a new intensity, as if the ship itself is afraid. Above, you hear shouting. Sailors running across the deck, their footsteps heavy and fast. Commands barked in voices you don't recognize. Urgent, clipped, stripped of the casual tone you've heard before. Something is happening. Something is wrong. And then the hatches close. The sound is unmistakable. Heavy wooden covers slamming down, cutting off the light, sealing you in. The hold goes dark except for the swinging oil lamps, their flames casting wild shadows on the walls. 300 people trapped in a wooden box, with no way out and no idea what's happening above. The storm hits. The ship lurches sideways, throwing passengers from their berths. Screams echo through the darkness. Children cry out for their mothers. Someone crashes into the water barrels, sending them rolling. The lamps swing wildly, and one goes out, then another, until only a few remain, their light barely enough to see by. The noise is overwhelming. The wind howls above, audible even through the sealed hatches. The waves strike the hull like fists, like battering rams, shaking the entire structure. The ship climbs a wave, hangs at the crest for a sickening moment, then plunges down the other side. Your stomach rises into your throat. You grip your berth with both hands, holding on as the world tilts and spins. People are praying. You can hear them even over the storm, fragments of Latin, of Hebrew, of languages you don't understand. Our Father, who art in heaven. Hail Mary, full of grace. Shema Yisrael. Words flung into the darkness like lifelines, grasping for something solid in a world that has become liquid and chaos. The vomiting begins almost immediately. Seasickness, which had faded for most passengers, returns with savage force. The sound of retching fills the hold. Dozens of people, hundreds, all sick at once. The smell, already bad, becomes unbearable. But there's nowhere to go, nowhere to escape. You breathe through your mouth and try not to add your own contribution to the misery. Hours pass, or minutes. Time loses meaning in the darkness. The storm continues, relentless, as if it will never end. The ship climbs and falls, each cycle bringing new terror. Will this be the wave that capsizes us? Will the next one split the hull? Is this how it ends? Drowned in the dark, thousands of miles from anywhere. Our bodies sinking to the bottom of an ocean no one we love will ever see. Some passengers give up hope. They lie in their berths, eyes closed, waiting for death. Others fight, securing loose objects, comforting the terrified, doing whatever small things they can to maintain order in the chaos. The differences between people become stark in crisis. Some rise, some collapse. Most simply endure, suspended between courage and despair. And then, eventually, it ends. The motion eases. The howling fades. The ship steadies, still rocking but no longer plunging. Above, you hear different sounds, voices, but calmer now. Footsteps, but slower. And finally, the blessed sound of the hatches opening, letting in light and air. You've survived. This time, the passengers emerge onto the deck, blinking in the sudden brightness. The sky is still grey, the sea still rough, but the worst has passed. Sailors move about, checking rigging, assessing damage. The ship is intact, battered, but intact. You look around at your fellow passengers. They look as bad as you feel, pale, shaking, covered in the evidence of the night's sickness. But they're alive. Everyone is alive. Not every ship is so lucky. The ships that didn't make it. The Atlantic crossing was dangerous. Genuinely, statistically, terrifyingly dangerous. Between 1847 and 1853, 43 emigrant ships failed to reach their destinations out of nearly 7,000 that attempted the crossing. 43 ships that sank, broke apart, vanished without a trace. Over 1,000 passengers dead in those 6 years alone. And those are just the ships we know about. The Coffin ships earned their name honestly. The term emerged during the Irish Famine, when the desperation to leave Ireland was so intense that people boarded anything that floated. Ships that should have been condemned were pressed into service. Hulls that leaked, rigging that frayed, captains who were incompetent or drunk or both. The emigrants had no way to judge a ship's seaworthiness. They bought their tickets and prayed. The Elizabeth and Sarah sailed from Ireland in July of 1847, carrying 276 passengers, 64 more than her legal capacity. She had 32 berths for those 276 people. The water barrels were inadequate from the start. No food was distributed for the entire voyage, despite what the law required. The captain got lost, adding weeks to the journey. 42 people died before the ship reached Canada. 42 bodies wrapped in canvas and slipped over the side, sinking into the cold Atlantic while their families watched. The survivors who finally staggered ashore were skeletons, barely alive, permanently damaged by what they'd endured. The Elizabeth and Sarah was not unusual. She was typical. The Virginia sailed in 1847 with 496 passengers. 158 died at sea. The Avon carried 552 passengers the same year. 246 died, nearly half. The Larch departed with 440 passengers and arrived with 108 dead and another 150 so sick they had to be carried off the ship. These numbers are hard to comprehend. Imagine boarding a ship with your family, looking around at the other passengers, and knowing that 1 in 3 of the faces you see will be dead before you reach land. Imagine watching those deaths happen, one by one, day after day, with nothing you can do to stop them. The causes of death were multiple. Storms claimed some ships outright, sending them to the bottom with all hands. But most deaths came from disease, from starvation, from the slow accumulation of misery that weakened bodies until they simply gave out. Not all ships were coffin ships. Some shipping companies maintained standards, kept their vessels seaworthy, hired competent crews. The Jeanie Johnston, an Irish ship, made 16 voyages between 1848 and 1855, carrying over 2,500 passengers. She never lost a single one. Her captain insisted on cleanliness, on adequate provisions, on medical care for the sick. He proved that the crossing could be made safely, that the deaths on other ships were not inevitable. But the Jeanie Johnston was the exception. For most emigrants, the voyage was a gamble. You paid your fare, you boarded your ship, and you hoped that the hull was sound, the captain was sober, the provisions were adequate, the weather would hold. Sometimes hope was enough. Sometimes it wasn't. Disease. The storm passes. The hatches open. You think the worst is over. Then the sickness begins. It starts with one person. A cough that won't go away. A fever that spikes in the night. A complaint of headache, of weakness, of something not being right. In the cramped quarters of Steerage, where everyone breathes the same air, sleeps inches apart, shares the same water and the same utensils, one sick person is a lit match in a room full of kindling. Typhus was the great killer. They called it ship fever because it spread so readily on ships, though it spread anywhere people were crowded together in filthy conditions. The disease is carried by lice, which were everywhere in Steerage. The lice fed on passengers, and the passengers scratched, and the scratching created wounds, and the wounds became infected with the bacteria that caused typhus. The symptoms were terrible. High fever, sometimes exceeding 104 degrees. A rash that spread across the body. Delirium, confusion, a mental fog that could make patients violent or catatonic. The disease killed quickly, within a week or 2 of symptoms appearing, and it killed often. Mortality rates of 10 to 40% were common. In some outbreaks, more than half the infected died. Cholera was the other terror. Cholera spreads through contaminated water, and we've already discussed the water. The bacteria could survive in those foul barrels, multiplying in the darkness, waiting to be drunk. Once inside a victim, cholera worked fast. Violent diarrhea and vomiting, leading to severe dehydration. A patient could lose a quarter of their body weight in fluids within hours. The cramps were excruciating. The thirst was maddening. Death could come within a day of the first symptoms. In 1853, cholera swept through the ships crossing from Liverpool to New York. Of 77 vessels that departed between August and October, 46 had cholera deaths during the voyage. The Washington lost 100 passengers. The Winchester lost 79. The total dead from those 3 months alone exceeded 1,300. When disease appeared in Steerage, there was little anyone could do. Ships rarely carried doctors. Some had medicine chests, basic supplies of laudanum, quinine, bandages, but no one trained to use them properly. Passengers doctored each other as best they could, drawing on folk remedies, on prayer, on whatever knowledge they'd brought from home. The sick were supposed to be isolated, but isolation was impossible in Steerage. Where would you put them? There was no separate space, no sick bay, no quarantine area. The infected lay in their berths, surrounded by the healthy, breathing the same air, touching the same surfaces. The disease spread because it couldn't help but spread. Families faced impossible choices. Do you stay with your sick child, holding her hand, mopping her brow, knowing that every moment of contact increases your own risk? Or do you keep your distance, protecting yourself, watching from across the aisle as she suffers alone? Most chose to stay. Love trumped fear. Usually, parents nursed their children. Spouses nursed each other. Strangers, sometimes, nursed strangers, recognizing that humanity demanded it, that abandoning the sick was a betrayal of everything they believed. Many of those who nursed the sick became sick themselves. The disease moved through families, through social groups, through the entire population of the hold. By the end of some voyages, there were barely enough healthy passengers left to care for the dying. Burial at sea. When someone died, they couldn't stay on the ship. There was no way to preserve a body. No refrigeration, no embalming, no means of keeping the dead from decomposing. In the heat of the hold, a corpse would begin to smell within hours. Within days, it would become a health hazard, a source of disease for the living. And so the dead were buried at sea. The ritual varied by ship, by captain, by the religion of the deceased. Sometimes a priest or minister would say words, ashes to ashes, dust to dust, adapted for an ocean burial. Sometimes passengers would gather on deck, singing hymns, saying prayers, witnessing the departure of their friend or family member. The body was wrapped in canvas, weighted with something heavy, a stone, a piece of iron, anything to make it sink. It was placed on a plank at the ship's rail. The plank was tilted, and the body slid off, dropping into the sea, disappearing beneath the gray waves. That was it. No grave to visit. No headstone to mark the spot. Nothing but open water, stretching in every direction, indistinguishable from every other patch of ocean. Your mother, your father, your child, your spouse, gone. Sunk to the bottom of the Atlantic, in a place you would never be able to find, never be able to return to, never be able to mourn properly. The burials were hard on everyone, but hardest on the families. A woman watches her husband's body slide into the sea. A father watches his daughter disappear beneath the waves. A child watches, not quite understanding, asking when the person will come back, not grasping that buried at sea means gone forever. Some passengers kept records. They noted names, dates, locations, as best they could estimate location in the middle of an ocean. These records were precious, the only evidence that the dead had existed, that they had been on this voyage, that they had come so close to America before being claimed by the sea. Others had no one to record their passing. They died alone, among strangers, their names unknown or quickly forgotten. They slid into the water and vanished, leaving no trace, their stories lost to history. On the worst voyages, the burials became routine. 1 a day, 2 a day, sometimes more. The passengers grew numb to it, or tried to. They had to. The alternative, feeling the full weight of every death, would have been unbearable. But the numbness was its own kind of wound. To watch death become ordinary, to see bodies committed to the sea like garbage thrown overboard, to lose the capacity for grief because there was simply too much to grieve. This was a spiritual injury that many survivors carried for the rest of their lives. Hope in the darkness. And yet, even in the worst moments, the storms, the sickness, the burials, there was hope. There had to be. Hope was the only thing that kept people moving forward, the only thing that made the suffering bearable. Hope came in small forms. A break in the weather. A meal that was slightly less terrible than usual. A child's laughter, somehow still possible even in steerage. A kindness from a stranger. A story told well. A prayer answered, or at least heard. Hope came from the knowledge that the voyage would end. Every day that passed was a day closer to America. Every nautical mile traveled was a mile less to go. The arithmetic of hope, Subtract the days behind from the days ahead, and the number grows smaller. Eventually, it reaches zero. Hope came from each other, from the solidarity of shared suffering, from the recognition that everyone in Steerage was fighting the same battle, enduring the same hardships, dreaming the same dreams. You were not alone. You were surrounded by 300 people who understood exactly what you were going through, because they were going through it too. And hope came from the destination itself. America. The word was magic. It meant land. It meant fresh water and fresh food. It meant space, room to move, room to breathe, room to build a life. It meant freedom from the things they were fleeing, the famine, the poverty, the persecution. It meant a second chance. We talked about America constantly, one survivor recalled. What we would do there, where we would go, who we would become. The talking kept us alive. It gave us something to live for. The crisis passed. For most passengers, anyway. The storms ended. The sickness faded or claimed its victims. The burials stopped. The ship continued westward, toward the horizon that never seemed to get closer. And then, one morning, something changed. A sailor climbed to the top of the mast, looked out at the horizon, and shouted two words that echoed across the deck and down into the hold. Two words that passengers had been waiting weeks to hear. Land ho! The landing. Land ho! The words spread through the ship like fire. Land ho! Land ho! Passengers who had been lying in their berths, exhausted, sick, resigned to another endless day at sea, they rose. They climbed the ladders, pushed through the hatches, crowded onto the deck. They shoved and jostled for position at the rail, craning their necks, shielding their eyes against the sun, searching the horizon for what the sailor had seen. And there it was. A thin dark line where the sea met the sky. Not a cloud. Not a trick of the light. Land. Solid, actual, undeniable land. Some passengers wept. They had been holding themselves together for 6 weeks, staying strong for their families, refusing to give in to despair, and now, finally, they could let go. The tears came, and they couldn't stop them, didn't want to stop them. They had made it. Against all odds, against the storms and the sickness and the coffin ships, they had made it. Some passengers prayed. They fell to their knees right there on the deck, thanking God for deliverance, promising devotion, offering gratitude for the miracle of survival. The prayers mixed with the tears, with the shouts of joy, with the laughter of children who didn't fully understand what was happening but knew it was something good. Some passengers simply stared. They watched the dark line grow larger, more distinct, more real. They watched America emerge from the sea like a dream becoming solid. They couldn't speak. They couldn't move. They could only watch and wonder, and hope that this was truly the end of the journey and the beginning of something new. The approach took hours. The land that had seemed so close remained stubbornly distant, growing larger by increments, revealing itself slowly. Hills appeared, then trees, then buildings. The shapes of a city emerged from the haze. Ships dotted the harbor, dozens of them, hundreds, more ships than most passengers had ever seen in one place. New York. For the millions who entered through this harbor, New York was America. It was the first thing they saw, the first soil they touched, the gateway to everything that came after. Whatever happened in the years ahead, the struggles, the successes, the lives they would build, this moment was the beginning. This was when it all started. The ship dropped anchor. The passengers waited, their excitement tempered by a new anxiety. They had survived the crossing, but the crossing wasn't quite over yet. The inspection. Before you could set foot on American soil, you had to be inspected. For most of the 19th century, the inspection happened at Castle Garden, a former fort at the southern tip of Manhattan that had been converted into an immigration depot. After 1892, it happened at Ellis Island, the famous gateway that would process over 12 million immigrants in its 60 years of operation. The purpose was the same in both places: to ensure that the people entering America were healthy enough, sane enough, and capable enough to support themselves. America wanted workers, not burdens. The inspection was the filter. The ship docked, and the passengers disembarked, cabin class first, of course, then steerage. They walked down the gangplank on shaking legs, their bodies still adjusting to solid ground after weeks of constant motion. The ground felt strange, too still, too steady. Some passengers stumbled, their sea legs betraying them. They were herded into lines. Long lines, stretching through the inspection hall, moving slowly forward. Officials in uniforms watched them, assessed them, made notes on clipboards. Doctors examined them, looking for signs of disease, the same diseases that had killed their fellow passengers during the voyage. The inspection was terrifying. A doctor would watch you climb a flight of stairs, checking for lameness, for shortness of breath, for any sign of physical weakness. He would look at your eyes, pulling back the eyelids with a button hook, checking for trachoma, an infectious eye disease that was grounds for immediate rejection. He would ask questions, assessing your mental state. Could you answer coherently? Did you understand what was being asked? A chalk mark on your coat meant trouble. L for lameness, E for eyes, X for mental deficiency. Those marked with chalk were pulled from the line, subjected to further examination, their fate hanging in the balance. Most passengers passed. The inspection was strict but not impossible. If you had survived the voyage, you were probably healthy enough to be admitted. The officials were looking for obvious problems, not minor imperfections. But some didn't pass. Some were turned away, sent back to the ship, sent back to Europe, their American dream ending before it began. Families were sometimes separated at this point. One member admitted while another was rejected. The scenes were heartbreaking. Husbands torn from wives, parents from children. The long voyage rendered meaningless by a chalk mark and a shaking head. For those who passed, there was one final step. The officials recorded your name, your age, your country of origin, your occupation. They asked where you were going, who was meeting you, how much money you had. They stamped your papers, handed them back, and pointed you toward the door. And then you walked through. First steps. You stepped out of the inspection hall and onto American soil. After everything, the decision to leave, the American wake, the journey to the port, the boarding, the storms, the sickness, the burials, the endless weeks in the dark hold. After all of that, you were here. You had arrived. You were in America. The city was overwhelming, louder than anything you'd ever heard, more crowded than anywhere you'd ever been. People everywhere, speaking languages you didn't understand, moving with a speed and purpose that seemed almost violent. Carts and carriages rattled over cobblestones. Vendors shouted, hawking food and goods and services. The smell was different. Less salt, more smoke. The smell of a city rather than an ocean. Some passengers had family waiting. They scanned the crowds, looking for familiar faces, hoping they would recognize someone they hadn't seen in years. When they found each other, the reunions were explosions of joy. Embraces that lasted minutes. Tears that wouldn't stop. Words tumbling out faster than anyone could understand them. Others had no one. They walked out of the inspection hall alone, carrying everything they owned, with nothing but an address on a piece of paper. A cousin's boarding house, a friend's apartment, a neighborhood where people from their village had settled. They asked directions from strangers. They got lost. They found their way, eventually, through a combination of luck and persistence and the kindness of people who had been where they were, not so long ago. The first days were disorienting. The first weeks were hard. The first years were a struggle. America was not the paradise some had imagined. The streets were not paved with gold. The work was grueling. The pay was low. The prejudice was real. Signs that said no Irish need apply. Neighborhoods where certain kinds of people weren't welcome. A new country with new rules, new obstacles, new forms of hardship. But it was also new opportunity, new possibility, new hope. They found jobs in factories, in mines, in construction, in domestic service. They saved money, penny by penny, dollar by dollar. They sent for family members who had stayed behind. They built communities, churches, schools. They had children, and those children had children, and the generations multiplied. They became Americans. What they carried. They arrived with almost nothing. A bundle of clothes, a cooking pot, a photograph, a prayer book, maybe a few coins sewn into the lining of a coat, hidden from thieves and customs officials alike. The physical possessions of a steerage passenger could fit in a single bag, but they carried things that couldn't be weighed or measured. They carried languages, Irish and German and Swedish and Yiddish and Italian and 100 others. They carried those languages into their new communities, teaching them to their children, keeping them alive even as English became the language of daily life. They carried recipes, the foods of their homelands, adapted to American ingredients. Soda bread and sauerkraut, pasta and pierogi, dishes that reminded them of home and became part of the American table. They carried songs, the melodies of their villages, their churches, their celebrations. Songs that would blend with other traditions, other influences, becoming something new, American music, forged from 100 different sources. They carried stories, the tales their grandparents had told them, the histories of their families, the legends of their people. Stories that would be passed down through generations, connecting great-grandchildren to ancestors they would never meet. They carried faith, the beliefs that had sustained them through the voyage, through the hardships of the New World, through everything that life would throw at them. Catholic and Protestant, Jewish and Orthodox, believers and doubters, all of them carrying some form of hope for something beyond the material world. They carried dreams, the visions that had pulled them across the ocean in the first place. Dreams of land, of freedom, of prosperity. Dreams for their children and their children's children. Dreams that would be partially fulfilled and partially deferred, passed on to the next generation to pursue. And they carried memory, the memory of what they had left behind, and the memory of what they had endured to get here. The American wake, the boarding, the storm, the sickness, the burials at sea, the first sight of land. Those memories lived in them, shaping who they became, shaping the families they built, shaping America itself. If your ancestors came to America, or ever crossed an ocean to start a new life, this might have been their story. Not exactly this story. Every voyage was different. Every passenger was different. But the broad outlines, the fear and the hope, the suffering and the endurance, the loss and the arrival, those were shared. Those were universal. More than 30 million people crossed the Atlantic between 1820 and 1920. 30 million individual stories, 30 million journeys, 30 million moments of watching the homeland disappear and wondering if the sacrifice would be worth it. Most of those stories are lost now. The passengers didn't write memoirs. They didn't sit for interviews. They lived their lives, raised their families, and died, taking their memories with them. We have fragments, letters, diaries, official records, but the full experience, the texture of daily life in steerage, the sound of the storms and the smell of the hold and the taste of the foul water, that's gone. We can only imagine it. But imagination matters. It connects us to the past. It reminds us that the people who came before us were real, not names on a census form, not branches on a family tree, but living, breathing human beings who suffered and hoped and endured. They endured so much. They endured the decision to leave, knowing they would never return. They endured the voyage, 6 weeks in darkness and misery. They endured the inspection, the uncertainty, the fear of rejection. They endured the early years in America, the poverty and prejudice and backbreaking work. They endured because they believed it would be worth it. Not for themselves, necessarily. Many of them never escaped poverty, never achieved the prosperity they dreamed of, but for their children, for their grandchildren, for you. Everything you have, everything you are, exists because someone, somewhere in your family's past, made that crossing. Someone endured the unendurable so that generations they would never meet could live better lives. That's the story of America. Not the story of presidents and generals, not the story of wars and treaties. The story of ordinary people, packed into the bellies of ships, crossing an ocean towards something they couldn't see but desperately believed in. They made it. Most of them. Against the odds, against the storms, against the sickness and the coffin ships and everything else the Atlantic could throw at them. They made it. And here you are, their descendant, their legacy, the living proof that the voyage was worth it. Sleep well tonight, and if you dream, dream of the sea. Dream of a dark hold filled with strangers who became a community. Dream of a thin line on the horizon, growing larger, becoming land. Dream of first steps on solid ground, shaking legs, overwhelming noise, terrifying freedom. Dream of your ancestors, whoever they were, wherever they came from, making the crossing that made you possible. They carried so little. They gave you so much. Good night.